I'm Mark Sector.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Arcane Mark.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about the secret to using tabletop RPG random tables like a pro. So, random tables, as I'm sure you've seen them in various different tabletop RPGs, they vary in how important they are in OSR games and a lot of old school RPGs. There might be tons of random tables where you just kind of use them for all sorts of things. In some more modern, like bigger RPGs, there are fewer random tables, whereas in indie RPGs, sometimes they don't have random tables at all. It all depends on what RPG you're playing. However, there is a secret of these random tables that if you start thinking of them that way, it will help you to use them more effectively and at the right times. And that is the fact that everything you know already about sort of when to roll dice in a tabletop RPG versus just kind of narrating it out, all those techniques, like, you know, if it's obvious that they can do it, like just walking down the street, you don't need to roll when it matters, roll when it's interesting, roll when it feels more earned to get it from the dice than just the GM saying, yeah, sure, you got it. Or it feels more fair for the dice to say no than the GM saying, no way, you can't. Well, random tables are essentially another kind of die roll with more kind of degrees of success and failure, and one that generally isn't based too much on the skill levels of the PCs. Although sometimes random tables will have like a slight biasing factor based on like, well, if you've been over hunting, then this hunting random table gets a penalty.
So that, then, hey, you're going to subtract 2 from your result or what have you.
On this D100, so it'll make some minor amount. But usually, they don't have anything like that at all. So if you think of it, they're kind of just similar to a flat check in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but with more than 4 results. A flat check could be turned into a random table. Like if you take the death and dying in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you could theoretically make a random table. Now, I know it changes depending on what your dying condition is, but like the baseline, you would have a random table with 4 percentages, one of which says like you die, and one of it says your dying increases, and one of it says your dying gets better, and one of it says your dying gets much better. So you can think of random tables as dice, and that way, if dice is something you understand better and die rolls, then it makes random tables a little bit less mystified and a little bit more obvious about when to use them.
Now, when you talk about random tables in that way, it is true that a lot of random tables will have some kind of way that they arrange their contents to talk about their difficulty. For example, if you have a random table of adversaries, you might have lower rolls represent easier encounters and higher rolls represent harder encounters. Or a random table of environmental dangers, you might have less severe, more minor ones in the beginning and then the harsher ones at the end. But random tables aren't required to have that. And you can have random tables for a lot of things.
They could be totally random.
Yeah.
Or they could be alphabetical, in which case they essentially might as well be random.
Because the thing is that random tables can be used for a wide variety of things. One broad category where they're often used is sort of threats, like I was talking about there, where you have, an environmental challenge or or like a monster or something like that. But random tables can also be used for things that are more sort of on the GM side of inspiration, like, a random table of personality quirks that an NPC might have, or, a random table of weird quirks that your magic item might have when you craft it. So in that sense, then random tables are more being used as a, hey, any of these things could happen, but, I don't want to be the one to necessarily pick them. Because but Mark was talking about before about, things feeling earned, if you give a player something and you're like, yes, your item has the quirk that's super useful for you, then they might be like, well, is that really fair? Did you just pick that? Or like your item has a quirk and it's not very useful. It might be like, are you just against me or whatever? But if you roll randomly, then it's like, well, and that's what the dice said.
So there are 3 major situations when you want to use a random table, and Linda has already described 2 of those sort of together at the same time. So let's start with the ones that Linda has already described. So the first time that you want to use a random table, and this one is crucial because the other 2 times you can use random tables that you wrote, but this is a time that you often want to use a random table that somebody else wrote. This is, you need inspiration. You're out of ideas, or you don't really know what to do for something, whether that's naming the NPC, coming up with a personality trait, like Linda said, or anything else. Now, theoretically, sure, you could then write a random table and then roll it. But if you don't even have enough inspiration to come up with one personality trait for the NPC, you probably don't have enough to come up with enough for a random table. And this is where it really pays to have a random table that someone else wrote. You can find those just about anywhere. You can find them online. You could find them in a different TTRPG entirely that uses random tables more. Like, seriously, there's a good number of OSR RPGs out there where over half of the page count is spent on random tables that could work for any game. And so if you have these other RPGs or certain products that are books full of random tables, you can use those to give yourself a random table when you need to be inspired. So when you need to be inspired is one of the key times to use the random table. Now, Linda got into the second. I even sort of mentioned it at the beginning. Using a random table when it will help the players feel like the result of it is more fair somehow. Now, is it really fair to have their fate determined by a die that just completely randomly decides it? And it's random between whether it's like they're encountering like some kind of a rat versus like a shambling mound that could kill them at first level. It's not necessarily, but it feels more fair than the GM just arbitrarily saying it was a shambling mound that killed them with no sort of step in between. It's like, why did you kill us with the shambling mounds? I just felt like it. Whereas it's like, well, in the Kingmaker encounter tables, there are a lot of different encounters, and it's very unlikely that you'll get a shambling mound, but we did roll that, and you're the one who decided to attack it instead of running away at that point. Like, at that stage of the game, it is about the fact that, like, the dice are the ones who brought about the results, and therefore it can feel more fair or earned to players than if the GM just arbitrarily decides it. So that's sort of the second stage. And the third one is just kind of like, you're not sure. It's not about fair or earned. Like, you have a few ideas, and any of those ideas you think it would be okay, and that the players would be okay with it. But you're not sure, and you think it would be interesting to just kind of see what happens. And in that case, you could have a random table that's pretty small. In fact, those random tables, the most, sort of the purest, smallest form of those random tables are situations that you'll see where the GM is like, I never thought of that. Where someone asks, like, is it possible that this environmental thing is happening that's good for us, or this other thing? I never thought of that. I'll just roll this D6 or D20, and high it is and low it isn't. That is, in fact, the sort of the genesis of that third use of random tables.
And Kojo mentions like the small random tables in PFS scenarios that are repeatable. Those are definitely in this third category of random tables where you're generally just trying to decide between a small number of options. In those cases, all those options are designed to work with the adventure, but it's the randomness is more so that the experience is different if you're playing through it multiple times.
And those give us a pivot actually perfectly into my next tip for using random tables like a pro, which is the official rule on many of those repeatable adventures. Now, I haven't read the most recent ones, but the ones I have read is that here's a random table, you can roll it, but if you know for a reason that, like, one of these choices would be better for your crew, maybe they've already done all of the ones on here except one, maybe There's one that is just a really good thematic fit for them. Maybe the one at the bottom is the hardest and they wanted the hardest one. You were allowed or encouraged to just pick one without rolling. And the super secret of these random tables is you can roll on them for inspiration. You can roll from them to just see what will happen. But either before you roll or after, if you roll and see a result and you're like, then it's okay to decide to roll again or to just pick something. If you realize actually after looking at the random table that you didn't really need it, or maybe that it gave a little inspiration because one of the results of the table is just too perfect.
Yeah.
You don't have to use it in the end, or at least you can mulligan out an option that seems really lousy.
Yeah, like for example, and this is going to be something that does tie in a little bit to the sort of sense of fairness with the players and things like that. You want to be transparent about how you're handling that.
Yes, it's very important because if you don't have an obvious and clear policy of mulliganing these options that seem really lousy, and you're doing something that would result in a really nasty scrape or effect for the PCs, they will, and you've already mulliganed a few things before, even though you didn't tell people when and where you're going to mulligan. And then you roll, like, the Shambling Mound, they'd be like, well, why didn't you mulligan that? You always mulligan these other things. When you mulligan the weather when you thought that it would be more interesting if it was raining, why didn't you mulligan the Shambling Mound? But if you, in advance, said, look, when it's just kind of random and I'm not sure, but I get good different vibes, I will mulligan the options, I will switch them around. But when it comes to random encounter charts, I will always use whatever the result says. I'm not ever going to re-roll it. I want you to know that because some of these are very challenging and you might have to run away.
Yeah, or you might say, like, I'm going to use this chart, but I'm going to re-roll a 9 or a 10 because those two encounters are extreme and I don't think it's fun if there's an extreme encounter that comes out of this.
Yes. Or you might even, if it was a D10 and the 9 and the 10 are extreme, you might say, hey guys, I'm using this table. I already don't like the 9 and the 10. I'm going to roll a D8 for this table.
Yeah. Or there might be ones that you remove just because they don't make sense. Like, you are using especially if you're using a table for a situation that's a little more specific. Like, maybe you're using a table that is generally for like encounters on the plains, and it has some monsters that like live in cold plains, but then like you're using like it's hot in the area that you're from, so you're not going to be like, okay, I'm not going to use the snow wolves because it doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense to use the snow wolves in the heat of the summer on the Great Plains. Or maybe you had a table of like level 10 monsters in the plains, not like the outer plains, like the hills and plains. And it was like a megalodon shark. And you were like, okay, guys, I don't think it's going to be a megalodon shark. I think we're going to do something else.
There's a comment, too. I'm not mulligans, but did they mention how we've run into 2 dragons? That's another great thing for, like, taking things off the list. If you're like, okay, I rolled Shambling Mound, but you guys already fought that Shambling Mound. There's not a second.
Right. And you might decide what the fiction of your table is. When you're learning about probability and randomness, there's an idea of like picking things out of a bag with or without replacement, right? Now, if you're using the same random table over and over again, like a random encounter table, you might have to think of the idea of, well, was there just one Shambling Mound that lives in this low-level area that's like the king of the forest? And the PCs beat it, so maybe they won't be able to roll again. Whereas if they ran away, maybe they can roll against it again. And in that case, that's another kind of thing that you could tell people in advance, but though that one is enough of a sort of common sense, I put in quotes, logic, that depending on your group, it won't necessarily succeed, but you probably could convince your group, even ex post facto, that that's reasonable. Where
it's
you're
like,
like,
okay, dragon,
guys,
but you already defeated
I rolled
the
this Shambling Mound, but you guys have beaten it. So I'm re-rolling. Or you could say, so you don't have to fight anything because your encounter should have been the mound. This was in its territory, but you've handled it. So your reward is no random encounter because you beat the Shambling Mound.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways that you can go about this. And even if you you might not be able to figure it out in advance, like Linda stated with the D10 where you decided to remove the 9 or 10, because sometimes the part of that secret of rolling but then realizing that in your heart it wasn't the right choice, sometimes you really did think that you needed to roll when you rolled. It was only upon seeing the result and feeling like the sort of the of that result that you realized in that moment that you needed to mulligan it or you wanted to mulligan it. It's possible that you just didn't know in advance.
Because you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to roll this table, and you didn't read the table in advance, and then you're like, oh, wait.
That's why if you let the players know, like even further in advance during session 0, that you like to use random tables for inspiration or to just when you're not sure what to do, but that you might mulligan them, and let them know if there's a type or two that you roll specifically for fairness, because the 3 use cases blend together, and you might roll for different reasons and more than one of those reasons. But if there's one you roll specifically for fairness, let them know. I rolled, and I'll use random encounter tables again. I roll these for the fairness of what the creatures are, so I'm not the one throwing them at you. I will not mulligan those, but maybe you can say, if you kill off certain creatures that are on this list, you'll get a free pass with no random encounter.
That may be what Math Guy's talking about. A trick in random tables is having special entries that added on the first reroll if it's a table that they use often.
So I think what Math Guy is might be indicating here, that's is that like if you remove something off the table, maybe there are special entries that that get added on instead as replacements, or maybe added after the first reroll for that reason. That way you won't have to reroll because you've sort of replaced the Shoveling Mound with a different entry that comes after that. And that's another thing you can do with random tables. They don't have to stay static. They can be evolving. In fact, if each random table is full of, let's say for encounters, is full of ideas that can tell a story, then it's possible that if the first thing that you encountered on that table was the first step of the story, then maybe the next thing you get after that was something else that required you to have beaten the Shambling Mound, but now you can encounter it because the Shambling Mound is defeated.
Oh yeah, that is what he's talking about, getting special encounters behind the reroll.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. And so maybe like if you rolled a 100 at first, you got the Shambling Mound, but now that you have its vines, if you roll 100 again, you find like a strange like gateway in the woods that has vines on it, but is missing a few vines that you have to wrap the vines from the Shambling Mound. It could open up and take you into a strange place. It only happened because the PCs did step 1 of fighting the Shambling Mound and then step 2 of finding the gateway next.
And when you're talking about adding things on, that can also go kind of into like that third category of tables. And this is one that I used a lot in Kingmaker because I had large tables of random events that mix things from the AP and some third-party books and people's suggestions online and my own ideas. And then the size of that table changed a lot over time because it basically like, you know, at one point it was like a D120, and then like it would shrink and grow like as I added more ideas or like as we did things, and then those things came off.
So if you're creating a living table like that, the way you handle it is the same way Linda did, which is when you roll something on that table, and then whatever it is, the PCs resolve it, decide whether that thing is removed or could recur again. Decide whether something else on the table was removed because of the way the PCs resolved the thing on the table that they did, and decide whether anything would be added to the table based on the solution the PCs chose.
Because the thing on the table might be, you know, this very specific encounter, or it might be like a broad theme, like, you know, factional disagreement or something like that. And it's like, okay, factional disagreement I can roll again, but like this specific event where there's an issue that happens at the apiary because bees have gone missing, like I'm not gonna run that specific event again.
Right, but if the PCs solve the issue by like helping to find the bees and then also importing bees from somewhere else, then you could wind up adding an event that is based on the place where they're importing the bees from, and possibly removing an event that was going to be on there about issues with the harvest that were based on losing the bees because they actually strengthened the number of bees.
And so maybe what happens then is that harvest issue event wasn't on there to start with either. But then depending on whether they've successfully resolved the bee event or not, then they have one or two replacements, harvest issues or trade dispute.
Exactly.
That comes out of it. Yeah.
So you can always allow the random table to evolve and evolve and continue its story. In fact, players often get excited when the random table is able to contain something that seems relevant in that same way instead of just being totally random. We found a pineapple walrus because the random table was just so chaotic and it makes no sense. Because then it sort of makes sense and it feels like they're telling an emergent story.
I also want to talk about with random tables that every outcome doesn't need to have the same probability.
In fact, it usually shouldn't.
Yeah, like usually you should have certain things that are like, it's much more likely for there to be a factional dispute than for there to be like a meteorological coincidence that causes a catastrophe among the animals or something like that. Where you have like you have things that way like you sort of set up the theme of like these kinds of things are more likely, they're going to happen more often, these kinds of things are going to be like, whoa, that's a weird thing that just happened. And then those rare things might go off the table after the first time that they happen.
Right.
Or you might have a situation where you have like some weird thing, but that you want to have that happen fairly soon, and so that's weighted pretty highly until it happens. Or something becomes more and more likely until it bursts forth.
That's right. And so like, even if you have a fairly simple table, like a weather table, except in certain seasons, in certain places, like most days, your weather is going to be fairly stable. Like in a lot of places, the chance of precipitation, like a big amount throughout the entire day, is not that high. And so if someone's like, well, is it raining? Because if it's raining, then we could do this other plan. Like, it usually doesn't make that much sense to be like, okay, 50-50, it's raining.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Even in that case, having the probabilities be different can sometimes make more sense. However, if you just don't care and you're like, well, it sounds like an interesting idea if it's raining, maybe you would just make it 50-50 so you don't have to like try to plot or model what the actual weather is like.
Yeah.
So, basically, that is how to master random tables, because it's possible that random tables can use you if you're just like sort of using them and you're not sure why, and they might be like kind of random or feeling jarring, and people are saying, what's going on? This adventure, this campaign doesn't seem coherent. But if you use random tables very intentionally and you make sure that you use them at those 3 times that we mentioned before, which are for inspiration, which are for the fairness or impartiality of the dying, and it is also for when you're not sure and it just seems like it would be random. If you use it for those times and you allow yourself to think about the roles, let them evolve, and even sometimes control or reject the roles, you can find that random tables will dramatically spice up your game and can potentially just really enrich it and allow for emergent gameplay that is different than the kind of gameplay you would have had if you just completely plotted out a kind of railroady thing in advance that was guaranteed to be like a one true storyline, just delta whatever the PCs do to navigate it.
So I've seen multiple comments in chat that I want to address. Matt Guy was talking about a specific thing from a recent one-shot that had 4 random encounters. The first reroll triggered the first story encounter, and the second reroll triggered the finale encounter, and then using that to pace out the adventure.
That's an example of his previous suggestion of when you reroll because you've already dealt with something on the random table, then you can add something else in there. And so that would mean that you were guaranteed to play Math Guy's encounters at least 3 times. The minimum would be 1 random encounter, then the story encounter, then the finale. However, the probability of that happening was only 1 in 16. It was much more likely that you would fight a second encounter or even a third encounter
but
before
then
you
it gets
reach the
more and
finale.
more likely that you move on the more things you do.
Yes, whereas it's also fairly unlikely that you actually come across all 4 of the random encounters and have to do 6 in that example.
Kojo then asked a question about solo RPGs, different oracle systems of random tables that people use to GM for them. Would this sort of advice be different in those cases?
So I would say yes. When you're using a solo RPG, the random tables in those solo RPGs are the GM. So if you are the GM, it is very okay to be like, yeah, I'm not feeling this random roll. This other one is just be so interesting right now for my players. I think let's change that or let's re-roll it. If you're playing a solo RPG where the random roll like legitimately decided what was going to be in here, it's like, okay, what's in this dungeon room? It says it's a beholder. I'd rather it be a 4-pole sword and 10,000 gold. So I've just decided that's what it is. You're kind of cheating the solo RPG at that point. So I would say that when you're playing in a game system where the random rolls are sort of sacrosanct, not completely sacrosanct, but they are the game, then it's different than if you're the GM and you are using your GM judgment to decide that something wouldn't be interesting.
But you might decide, like, you might make, like, a decision for interest, for example, where, like, okay, you know, I have a rule when I'm playing this game for myself that if I roll the same result 3 times that I can re-roll because, like, it gets boring to just do the same thing over and over again.
Right. Or you could also just say that you're gonna skip that. Yeah. Because it'd be like, I've beaten this encounter.
You know, whether it's a good encounter or a bad encounter, I'm not gonna repeat results or something like that.
You might do that, especially if it's a solo RPG where there's like multiple choices and then there might be like a little booklet that tells you what to do, and after doing it the first 2 times you're like, well, if I do this and then that, they're just gonna give me a reward with no die rolls. So
so I guess
I could have just done that again, so instead I'm just gonna re-roll it. Like, you could decide. You could decide at what point that changing the results in that is not cheating yourself. Obviously, you don't have to go all the way out to the extreme of replacing the enemy beholder with a 4-pole sword and 10,000 gold pieces. Yeah. There are other ways to do things. So, like, honestly, some people play games on, like, invincibility mode or other things like that. So you do you.
I mean, you're playing like, people do all kinds of things with solo games, right? People mod their solo games and things like that. So
you do you. But you can play on extreme mode and re-roll all of the treasure into beholders.
Yeah. I would say that it's probably going to be more fun if up front you decide what the rule is going to be so that you have a consistent experience.
That's right. If you have created your own mode, like re-roll all treasure rooms into beholders, and you make that roll at the beginning, you're kind of aren't breaking the roll because you knew that was your roll. Or vice versa, re-roll all beholders into treasure rooms. Like, it might sound ridiculous when I suggested doing it arbitrarily here on the show, but if you already had that as a rule, you were like, this game, Dungeons and Beholders, this solo game, just like 50% of the rooms that were supposed to be treasure rooms are actually beholders, and it doesn't make sense, and so I'm just going to change them into treasure rooms. Like, I don't know. There are ways that you can make things work.
So there's a comment, how different this episode would be if Kelsey was here to talk about tables. What does Kelsey think about tables?
Well, I mean, Shadow Dark is actually one of the... Well, Shadow Dark is like, you know, it's not completely just old school revival. It's more like in the old school Renaissance-y situation where it has lots of old school vibes and mechanics, but combines in some newer stuff like advantage and disadvantage, which really works for it. It also, I would say, is one of the games in that sort of sub-genre that has a lower percentage of random tables than some others. Like, there are others that are, like, almost all random tables, whereas in Shadow Dark, there's a lot of pages of of things that aren't random tables. So, so I actually don't know exactly what her take on random table is.
Have you heard her
I'm
talking about random tables, Math Guy?
I'm fairly. I think it's fairly likely that she likes random tables. But I don't think they've come up in the several times that she's been on Roll for Combat Live.
Yeah.
All right. So, did you have any other secrets of random tables?
No, I think we've discussed the main things that I wanted to get to.
So, take control of your random tables by leaving them with some of the control. Take control by giving up control. Figure out why you are using them.
Is it inspiration, or is it to make the decision?
That's right. And then set up expectations in advance. And don't let the random table rule you, because you're still the GM. And if you feel that it's wrong, you can always make a change. So if you do it that way, then your random tables can really enrich your game. All right. So everyone, please, before you go, you can like and subscribe or join if you are interested in supporting us, and vote for our next Saturday episode.
Vote that's somewhere up there.
We had a vote for 3.
David voted for 3.
For 3, which was tools shaking things up.
Yes, for when things get stagnant.
They might get stagnant or stale. There's ways to shake things up.
Let's give folks XPs as well.
I am going to give you XP, so do stick around, even if it's just to get all the XP. And let us know what you'd like to see on next Saturday. More people want to see 3. So
seems that tyranny is
yes,
going to win
we
again.
will not be shaking things up because we are.
The tyranny of shaking things up.
We will not be shaking things up because we'll be doing tools again, which is about shaking things up, which ironically contradicts itself.
There we go.
There we go. Next Saturday will be tools of shaking things up. That will be in April. So don't forget that Roll for Combat always has a free April Fool's product. So you'll be able to find it on Tuesday.
Oh yeah, are we going to be talking about that on Arcade Mark on Tuesday instead of our usual?
Oh yeah, let's do an April Fool's episode on the April Fool's product on Tuesday, since we have an Arcade Mark then. Instead of what we were supposed to be doing, which I think was spells, selecting your spells.
Selection. So spell selection will be the Tuesday after that, the 8th.
All right. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you either on Tuesday for the April Fool's episode, on Saturday for this new episode that just won about shaking things up, or whenever you come next, or maybe never if you're like, I just want a random table.